Hello, I'm Liz Ness, and this is 20 Questions, a series devoted to post-processing images from start to finish. It's the approach I use when processing my own digital photos. And rather than a single recipe that may not be suitable for all images, this method treats each unique image uniquely. The goal is to bring out the best within our images. For the series, we'll be equipped with our list of 20 questions, 3 different photos, and various Photoshop Elements tools. We'll get started by using Photoshop Elements Camera Raw tool and making decisions about image exposure and white balance. Next, we'll evaluate the lighting, color, and overall structure of our photographs, determining whether or not adjustments are in order. Finally, we'll add finishing touches to our photographs and make sure we've applied all our adjustments subtly, as a way to reveal and enhance, rather than mutate, that which makes our photographs their best. To get started, launch Photoshop Elements. Next, select the Expert view. Then go up to the menu bar, select Windows and Layers so that we can view the Layers panel. And then we're going to go down to the Photo Bin and open that, since we're going to be working on 3 different files. Now we're ready to open up our file. We're going to open it up in Camera Raw. Even if your photos are not in Camera Raw, you can still utilize the Camera Raw tool. So let's go ahead and do that. I'm going to select our first image here. Then once the file is open, consider the following questions. The first 4 in our list of 20. What would you like to preserve, enhance, or alter within the image? Is there an exposure point that you'd prefer over the original? Would you prefer more contrast to convey depth? And are the whites as bright and the blacks as dark as you'd like for the image? Alright, let's start with that first question. When it comes to this image, the backstory that I'm considering here is my son ducking underneath some park equipment. Now, I didn't get a chance to adjust camera settings simply because we were running around and I just happened to have my snapshot camera with me. I captured this one look in the second that he gave it to me, and as soon as he did this, he was off again. So I recognize that the exposure isn't quite what I'd like, and I'd like to improve that for him. I also, in looking at it now and thinking about what I'd like to preserve or enhance, I think I'd like to enhance his face just a bit and bring it out more. And that doesn't necessarily mean by doing something crazy to it. It means that I might change this into a black and white photo simply because I've got green and orange, which are contrasting colors, and they're really right around his face, and they kind of argue for attention. And I think as I brighten this all, the orange is going to get brighter and the green is going to get brighter, and create even more of a front stage sort of argument against his face. Another thing, he's underneath park equipment, and I didn't have a great opportunity for framing, and I don't really like this pole coming out of his head, so I think I'll probably do something to get rid of that. So those are all the things that I'm thinking about as I start out post-processing here. When I get to the next question, is there an exposure point I prefer over the original? The answer is yes. I want this a little bit brighter. So I'm going to go ahead and start messing with my exposure slider here. And sometimes I like to just really slide it high and really low so I can just see what's happening within the image itself. All of the midtones, the shadows, and the highlights, just to see what happens. And then usually I can find something that I prefer. And just a little bit more there. Okay, and the next question is about contrast for conveying depth. Now there's pretty good depth here simply because I have a nice focus on him and some blur in the background, so he really kind of stands out, but I still want to play with contrast just to see if there's something I'm missing here. Okay, now it looks like when I play with this that it's primarily affecting his sweatshirt, although other things are impacted by the slider move. So I want to think about, I think I'm not going to add any contrast in this method. Okay, simply because I don't want to bring out the sweater any more than it already is. Next are the whites as bright and the blacks as dark as I'd like in this image. Well, I can tell you I want the whites just a little bit brighter. So I'm going to go down here, and I like to work with these 2 sliders together because they add a lot of contrast as you slide them. So pulling this white, and I don't want the blown out background, which it is blown out, to argue too much and pull our eye too much because of its brightness away from my subject here. On the other hand, I do want to brighten the whites up for him a little bit. And the blacks are just helping convey a little more depth, but I want to be really careful and go subtle on this. Okay, this combination looks pretty good to me, so I'm going to stick with this, and I'm going to go ahead and open my image. Before I get started on the next set of questions, I'm going to open up my next file. Again, in Camera Raw. And considering the questions again, the backstory is that we were at Bryce Canyon, and it was a very hazy day, which was bouncing the light everywhere, and you could see the image captured is pretty hazy, but I know that I can clean this up. So that's one of the things I want to do. Another thing I think of when I look at this image is it doesn't convey the warmth of the place that I remember of the place. So I want to work on the colors just a tad. I want the whites a little bit whiter, I want these darks a little bit darker, and I want to make the reds and the yellows just a little more vibrant so that they really convey the sunlight coming through and the warmth. And of course, I really want to clean up this haze. Did I mention the haze? All right, but I'll deal with that in a later step. So let's go through our next question here. Is there an exposure point I prefer over the original? Actually, I feel pretty good about this exposure, but just to really make sure that I do, I'm going to play around with the exposure point. Now, one of the things I noticed right away is when I bring the exposure down, is I get a lot better sky. So I might consider actually turning this into a composite at some point where I accept this exposure and then open up the image again and take in the original exposure and then blend the two. But for this particular demonstration, I'm just going to choose one. I'm not going to make a composite, but that's something you could do. So in doing that, I'm going back to my original. I can always type in 0 to take it back to as shot exposure. Next, would I prefer a bit of contrast? I know that I would, but I'm not sure that this particular tool is the tool that I would like to use for that, because this tool in the contrast is making this area over here look a little too pixely to me. I mean, it's hard to see this, I'm sure, in the video, but it makes it look too sharp and artificially so, and doesn't convey contrast in the way I'd like. So I'm going to take that back to 0 as well. Next, are the whites as bright as they can be and the blacks as dark as they can be? I've already decided that no, they're not. So I'm going to go ahead and play with those together and see what I can do. Okay, the whites, ooh, looking nice down here. Just like to do subtle changes at first. Oh yes, okay, really like that with the blacks. And notice that I get the contrast I was after just in playing with the blacks, the shadows, and the whites, highlights, and making a little more contrast that way. And I prefer getting it that way. It doesn't make this look so strangely square or pixelated. Okay, I feel pretty good about this, so I'm going to go ahead and open my image. We're going to go to our final image, open in Camera Raw. Alright, the background here is I was using a wide angle lens and trying to get a strange warped shot. But it was also quite stormy that day. Lots of wind and lots of rain, and though I tried to keep my lens dry, you can see that I got a couple drops that I would want to remove. I want to preserve this strange look here, but I remember this being just a tad warmer than this image conveys. So there was a little more yellow and the red was just a little redder. Now it was a pretty awful day, so you know there wasn't a whole lot of sun on the subject here. But I think I can bring some of those colors back in. And let's see, I also noticed that the horizon is a little warped, and I don't want to really play with these lines, but we'll look at them later on even so. Okay, so exposure point. I think this is probably pretty good. Yes, if I go either direction, it changes in a way that I don't like. Contrast, same thing. It's changing my midtones in a way that I don't like, making it a little too dark or gray. I like it the way it was originally, so back to 0. And the whites, if I play with the white too much, it blows out my sky just too much. And let's take a look at the darks. It can add a little bit of depth to it, but it kind of takes away some of the brightness that I like. So I'm going to take those both back to 0. I'm not going to actually make any corrections through Camera Raw. Alright, open image. Now that all 3 images have been opened within Elements, we're ready to move on to our next set of questions centered on lighting.